Okay, can we start again? This is a real determination of the really committed people and those people who want to eat. And we've given a shout down below, and I think they're finishing off. I'm looking, this session, we've discussed alternatives to energy, alternatives to austerity. This session is about public ownership, not private profit. We're going to look at issues around particular industries, rail, looking at NHS and others. But to kick off, I'm going to bring in a couple of introducers, and then we'll open it up. And there's a number of other people as well who've indicated, who've been advising us over the years that we want to bring in. I want to introduce our first introducer, who, well, I think is one of the finest socialists I've ever met, Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy.
Thanks, John, and thank you all very much for being here today, and thank you, John and Seb, for all the work that's been put into organising today's event, because I was beginning to feel completely left out when all I get is emailed stuff on the parliamentary inbox to go to progress conferences and favourite society conferences, and goodness knows what other kinds of things. I thought, where are we? Well, we're here, okay? And we're going to put some good ideas forward. I want to make a short contribution and then make one announcement and one proposal. We are not having a special session on international affairs today because we have a very short time and we have a lot of very pressing other things on the agenda. But I want you just to think for a moment that the international strategy adopted by Britain since 1945 has had a crucial effect on all our domestic policies, levels of spending on social services, our civil liberties, and a very large number of other things. Arms expenditure of the top 10 spenders in the world amounts to $1 trillion a year. Britain is the fourth largest arms spender in the world. We spend $54 billion a year on arms. It is a vast sum of money. The incoming Parliament will be required in 2016 to make a decision on whether to renew the Trident nuclear missile system, building the submarines to fire the missile from, or not. And that is going to be a very fundamental decision in many ways. Because if Parliament, I hope doesn't, but if it does vote to continue the system and renew it, it's going to set up a forced expenditure for the next 25 years, which will amount to £100 billion. But it will also be illegal within the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It would also, in my view, be utterly and totally immoral that we should be spending that amount of money on weapons of mass destruction that can only kill very large numbers of civilians wherever they're fired from. I was one of those that attended the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons Conference in Vienna in December. Eventually, Britain and the USA were shamed into attending and did. Their contribution was less than helpful, but at least were in the room, I suppose. And the stuff is mind-blowing. One nuclear bomb set off anywhere would be a local environmental, humanitarian and economic catastrophe, and it would set off a chain of events that would lead to a massive global recession, environmental disaster, and if retaliated to, and that is very likely, you've then got a nuclear winter on your hands. And so when those in our party say that we need nuclear weapons for security, I ask them this simple question. How do they make us secure? And if you believe they would, then I assume you're prepared to fire one of them off. And will you live with the consequences of the millions that die because of your decision? I think we'll be quite robust with people on the moral question of nuclear weapons. Now, we were led into a war in 2003 by deception and lies, by Blair and by others. 140 Labour MPs, I always include Dennis Skinner in that because he was in hospital having heart surgery and to his eternal anger couldn't get back to vote for it, but I always include Dennis in the 139, including Dennis, so 140. The consequences of that war and the Afghanistan war have been Guantanamo Bay, have been draconian anti-terror legislation on both sides of the Atlantic, have been the development of ISIS, of Boko Haram, of many, many other organisations. We have begat war after war after war by our intervention, by the lies that were told around it, and the situation, as I see it, can only get worse unless we recognise the fundamental problem, which is our own foreign policy in the first place, of the presumption we have a right to intervene anywhere to protect so-called Western interests. In reality, these are wars for the arms industry and wars for the mineral industry at the same time. I think we need to be fully aware of that. The background of this party was after the Second World War, we took part in the establishment of the UN, great. We took part in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, great. And we set up NATO. Douglas Alexander seems to think all three things were of an equally valuable contribution to the planet. I'd include the first two and delete the third. We have to get real about what our foreign policy should and could be. And therefore, I hope that the foreign policy issues won't go away up to the election. CMD are going to be lobbying very hard to get commitment from Labour candidates to vote against Trident renewal. There are going to be many others lobbying on human rights and all those issues. But there's also going to be a big lobby around TTIP and the dangers for all of us when we hand power over to multinational corporations to run economies and trade on both sides of the Atlantic. We need a different foreign policy strategy. We need one that doesn't extol the virtues of arms sales to Saudi Arabia where it carries on beheading people, doesn't set up a military base in Bahrain while it's shooting demonstrators on the streets outside, and that isn't one that keeps quiet about human rights abuses where the economy of that country is supposedly beneficial to Britain and makes a big noise about it elsewhere. We need a foreign policy that recognises the environmental destruction that carries on around the world and plays a much more serious role in those issues. So my suggestion is that we be aware of all these things and the implications for all of us of the foreign policy that we have in this country, and sadly the foreign policy that has too often been adopted by our party, and that after the election, probably end of May, beginning of June, something like that, I'm proposing that we have a special one-day conference on what foreign policy we would like to see from a Labour government and to pursue within that Parliament and, of course, in our public demonstrations, so that we bring together trade unionists acting in solidarity with each other against TTIP, environmental activists trying to prevent forest destruction in India, Brazil or elsewhere in solidarity with us, and peace activists all over the world opposing wars and opposing nuclear weapons. Things can change. Look what's happened in Greece. Quite amazing what's happened in Greece, where they stood up against austerity and said, we're simply not having it, we're not going to allow the rich to carry on enriching themselves. There is some hope of much stronger left movements all across Europe and indeed all across the world. And so I have to announce that on the Sunday the 15th at 1 o'clock in the afternoon there's going to be an emergency demonstration in solidarity with the people of Greece against what the European Central Bank and all the other bankers are trying to do to it. And I think we should all be there showing our solidarity with the people of Greece. They are standing up, they stand up, we stand up. That's two lots of people standing up. Multiply that by a few 100 million, you've got a very, very powerful force indeed. International affairs matter. Human rights abuses matter. Our contribution in selling arms, destroying human rights and environments of people in distant places matters. The consequences, and I'll finish on this point, John, the consequences of the wars in the Middle East are there to be seen in many ways, but they're also there in the hundreds, nay the thousands, of desperate migrants that are dying in the Mediterranean, dying on the borders between Mexico and the USA, where poor people from Central America are trying to escape their poverty. That is the real consequences of a self-centred foreign policy that is actually working in the interests of the military and the biggest corporations in the world. We need a human foreign policy. Let's go for that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeremy. This session is about public ownership in particular, but we also have our own financial crisis at this meeting. We need to collect some money to pay for the hall and to make sure we're paying the person who's filming this rather than the minimum wage. So a bucket, I believe, and a bag, this is all we can afford these days, is going around. We'd be grateful for any contribution that you can make. I want to go straight now into the discussion on public ownership. One of the key demands we've been making on the left is bringing rail back into public ownership. It's one of the most popular policies in all the opinion polls. We have the rail unions here with us, and I'll start off with Nick Cash, General Secretary of RMT. Nick.
Thanks very much, Rector. And just need to remind ourselves that rail privatisation has been with us now for about 20 years. Also, bus privatisation, over 30 years, 1985 was bus regulation that created the privatisation discovered. And the problems we've got even today, you've seen the bus strikes recently where United workers were striking for a fair wage and treating company workers. You see the consequences even today in the bus industry as well as the rail industry. But if you look at the rail industry and rail privatisation, you think of a number of things, concerns about safety, think about high fares, huge profits to companies, huge subsidies. You see a situation where the passengers and the taxpayers take the risk, and yet the private ears take the rewards. And yet equally, as we are standing here today, I think, for the first time in a long, long time, we've got an opportunity on rail, and dare I say even on bus, to actually reverse privatisation. But we're also facing some real onslaughts at some time. Austerity-driven onslaughts, squeezes, cost squeezes. We're seeing a situation where government seeks to cut costs, while at the same time the private ears seem to maximise their profits. Well, what does that mean? Well, actually, what we're seeing today, in London, we're here in London, but if those of you from North of England will know that the refranchising the Northern Rail franchise and Transcontinental Express franchises, biggest franchises in the country actually. And what they're looking to do there, to maximise profits, to cut costs, they're looking to fare increases. They're looking to close or reduce close booking offices or close or reduce their open hours. They're looking to restart stations. They're looking to introduce driver-only operation, get rid of guards off the trains. Descarb trains. They're looking to service cuts. They're looking to continue to use 30-year-old trains, actually looking to export London Underground trains from here, ones that are no good to be used on the Tube network anymore, and use them up the north. That's what we're looking for. We're looking to increase or maintain overcrowding, all in the pursuit of cutting costs and maximising profit. That is the future in rail franchising if we allow it to continue. That's why today's meeting and what's going to happen in May and this year is going to be important in trying to put an alternative up to privatisation. Because there is a public sector alternative. There is a public sector alternative. And that's the important message we've got to get across. As John has said, I think Andy said earlier on, public ownership of the railways is popular, extremely popular. 70% of the population would support it across all political spectrums. But we've had a situation where we've had public ownership working in practice. We've had East Coast trains for the last 5 years, and they're going to be reprivatised. I think in March is when they're actually being taken over by Stagecoach and Virgin again. But for the last 5 years, they've been running as a public sector body, run by the government, by directly operated railways. And in that time, they've put £1 billion back to the exchequer, back to the taxpayer, as well as running an efficient, well-run train service. Now, that was on the back of 2 private sector operators failing over a number of years. Public sector works. Public sector is more efficient and it's cost effective. We've seen a situation where recent studies have shown that actually, if you get rid of privatisation and the structure of privatisation, you can save £1 billion a year. £1 billion across the whole network, because it costs a lot of money to run the privatised network. And what would that mean? Well, that would mean an 80% fare cut. You could cut fares. Or you could be investing in new trains, more trains, so you have less overcrowding, safer trains. You could have a situation where you, in a position where we have a proper service where you don't have to cut trains, services, you don't have to have people cutting them out like sardines. You can have a real proper railway service. But that isn't happening. That isn't happening at this moment in time. But there is an alternative. That can happen, and we have an opportunity for that to happen. We have a situation today where Network Rail has been nationalised by the Tories. We've got public ownership of the infrastructure. So if we can have public ownership of the infrastructure, why can't we have proper ownership of the operations of the trains? If that's the case, and this is the reason why our arguments are strong and important, and now why the opportunity we face in the next election is going to be important. We have a situation, right, ironically, although I sort of say about public ownership, that we have got public run train services in this country. They're just run by the Dutch, the German and the French companies. 75% of the train operating companies are actually owned by the French, the Dutch and German governments. The money that we pay as taxpayers and fare payers, the passengers pay, actually ends up going back over to France, Germany and Holland. Now, where's the rationale in that? The money that we spend should be reinvested back in the services of this country, if nowhere else. So what we have, as I said earlier on, is a major opportunity, the best opportunity we've had for years, because the vast majority of the franchises are up for grabs after the election, next election in May. The vast majority. That means we could have an alternative. Instead of trying to refranchise the train operating companies, keep it back in the private sector, we could create a situation where we turn around and say, as they come up, they get operated put back into the public sector, operated by the state, for the use of people and get rid of all the profit motions. So this is crucial for us, this election, in terms of making sure we put renationalisation back on the map. What we need, though, as part of that, and what the program needs to do, we need to make sure that no more franchises are re-let. We want to make sure that Northern franchise and TPE franchises are actually kept back and not re-let as franchises, and they're kept going, run by the extended franchises. Because the difficulty we've also got is that as at this moment in time, unless you're in a situation where you've got a failing company, like we've had on the East Coast, it's illegal for the government, for the country, the state to run or operate a train service. So we need a change in the law. So we need to stop, in the first place, to continue the franchise model, and then we need, as early as possible in the next Parliament, is to change the 1993 Railway Act, which privatised the train services, to allow the government to run the services going on. And as that happens, then as every franchise comes in, instead of giving it out to the private sector, just put it back into a government state-run company. So that's what's at stake. I hope you continue to support that, and thanks very much for the opportunity to press it today.
The NHS is one of the other big issues that we've been campaigning on. We've been campaigning alongside those campaigning organisations that have actually secured some victories. I want to introduce Tony Sullivan, who's a consultant paediatrician at Lewisham and Greenwich NHS. He will tell us about the impacts on his particular area of the NHS.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to John and to the meeting. I thought it would be good to just talk about the Lewisham and South East London fiasco from a couple of years ago to illustrate just how close we are to losing our NHS entirely and how urgent it is that during the election campaign and after the election, every effort is made to reclaim the NHS and to put it back into public ownership. Interesting, you just looked about the rails having public ownership of the property. Increasingly, we've lost public ownership of hospital after hospital, and a lot of people don't realise that. And a lot of the PFI contracts that are in place, there actually isn't a guarantee that the NHS will own the building at the end of the 30-year PFI contract. And we've taken over Woolwich Hospital in the Lewisham Trust because of the breakup of the South London Healthcare Trust, of which more later. And the leasehold for the Woolwich site was given to Meridian Company for 125 years. And that's the extent to which our NHS has been put in jeopardy. Now, you probably all know about the attack on the NHS in South East London. Maybe a brief reprise of that, because it points to the importance of rolling back legislation and various other urgent measures. June 2012, the South London Healthcare Trust was declared bankrupt. That's an entirely different trust to Lewisham. I don't agree with the terms of them being declared bankrupt. That's a construct of the way the NHS has been run, but that was so. The unsustainable provider regime was used. That was a piece of legislation put in by the last Labour government, and something else that needs to be taken apart, really. It was really used for trusted financial crisis, but it allowed you to ride roughshod over democratic consultation, and over a 6-month period, the TSA, the Trust Special Administrator, recommended a massive fundamental reorganisation of healthcare for 1.7 million people, and there were 30 days of public consultation in that period. And that again is the extent to which we are losing our ownership and our democratic control of the NHS. The Save Lewisham Hospital campaign was a magnificent success. It had fantastic support from the community. It had very good support indeed from the local Labour MPs and the Labour Council. It was a broad alliance of all the political activists in Lewisham. It had fantastic support from the country, and it's still very active now. You will know that the campaign took Jeremy Hunt to court and won twice in July 2013, and again when they appealed in October 2013. So Lewisham Hospital, in the sense that there was an illegal attack on it, or an illegal attack on it, won. But it's by no means safe, and it's now on the same footing as hospitals up and down the country, and the NHS up and down the country, where it's being strangled financially day by day. I just want a little bit more, tell me if I'm running out of time, but a little bit more detail of what's going on there, because it is illustrative. When Lewisham Hospital was put up for closure, it's now safe, but that was on the back of the closure of another hospital in Sidcup, Queen Mary's Hospital, in 2009-10. And all the beds there were lost, and then they were going to close 450 beds in Lewisham. When we won, and then we had to take over a hospital that was deemed as the failing hospital, there's been a huge tension on the NHS, really destabilising. But the CQC, Care Quality Commission, then came straight in less than 5 months later to inspect us, to say that whether we were adequate or inadequate. They said that we didn't have enough beds, that Queen Elizabeth was unsafe and we needed at least 75 more beds. And we were just after saving a hospital that was going to be 450 extra beds lost in the system. What's known as the winter crisis in Woolwich and up and down the country is not a winter crisis any longer. It's a crisis day by day, 12 months of the year. Woolwich recently has been the busiest hospital in London. Woolwich and Lewisham have also on occasion been the worst performing areas in London, not because we're hopeless, but because the whole system is absolutely overwhelmed. There are interesting proposals about uniting healthcare and social care. In one way, I'm completely and utterly behind that. In another way, there's a danger that the sort of the threshold by which a lot of people are excluded from social care will start to be applied to healthcare. That's something that I would really warn against. We're also up against years and years of skill mixing, driving down the banding, nurses going from band 8 to band 7, band 7 to band 6, and at Bath is one of the worst in the country, driving down to band 5s, running ward, and healthcare assistants. And we really got to be aware that one of the consequences of the drive for foundation trust status, which is something else that was introduced with the last Labour government, I do feel that should be part of the reversal process, is that management have put financial priorities over above clinical care. And that was the fundamental reason, of course, for Stafford. It came to pass that there just weren't enough nurses on duty. That's also true at Lewisham, it's true at QE, it's true up and down the country. There simply aren't enough nurses. And over the last few years, the training establishments have reduced their numbers by 4,000 of the training places for nurses, so there just aren't enough nurses. So in Lewisham and in QE and everywhere else, however well-intentioned the NHS is locally, we have to spend millions of pounds on agency nurses, millions of pounds on agency doctors. So that is a drive towards privatisation privatisation as well, because you then run out of money and then you're deemed to be a failed trust. That's yet another example of just how far we've gone down the road. Just one example of PFI is that the Queen Elizabeth Woolwich Hospital, the capital cost of that was 118 million. 118 million. The payback, that's for the building, and then there are also the 30 years contract is also services like portering and security and catering and so on. The payback will be 1.03 billion. That's over 30 years, so that's tenfold, and on the capital cost alone it's probably 6 or 7 times the original cost. Some of the impacts of PFI are more than just the money for the building. The services are given out to subcontractors. So ISS runs facilities management at Queen Elizabeth Woolwich, and they pay basically minimum wages. The GMB recently have discovered in the dispute to bring their staff up to NHS rates of pay that the ISS contract has demanded over the last few years £3 million from the local NHS under an agenda for change clause, and they think that has actually been potentially fraudulently claimed from the NHS, and the staff are still on minimum wages and not on the agenda for change. So that's one aspect of PFI. Another is that Toshiba run the equipment contract for Queen Elizabeth Woolwich. And one of the things they do is that there's no risk at all, and they build in that they will replace, for example, an MRI scanner once or twice in the cycle, and then they don't. They leave it right up to the wire. So it's a 15-year contract. If they then renew it a year before the contract ends, unless the trust renews that TFI contract, they have to buy that MRI scanner back from Toshiba at market prices. So they've actually, there's emails virtually every week that the MRI scanner is down to leave, and it's because they've got dodgy equipment that they haven't done. Right, so I'm going to wind up now and just say that I think we've gone a long, serious way to losing our NHS. I'm also part of Keep Our NHS Public. I'm also part of the campaign for the NHS Reinstatement Bill, of which John is one of our sponsors. Thank you very much. I don't think the Labour Party realise what an open goal they've got to shoot into in defending the NHS. I don't think they realise that the bill falls short on many things, and we have to actually get away from the whole marketisation of our healthcare. And in whatever shape or form we do it, we have to take away foundation trust status. We have to put the hospitals and the community services back in the lap of the NHS and public ownership. So I think what I would really like to hear from the Labour Party is just a simple apology about PFI. We got it wrong, and we won't do it again. I don't know why that's so difficult. It seems to be sort of Labour months ago around apologising. That's a good one to apologise and recommit to the NHS. Be very clear about privatisation. Privatisation is not in order unless in extreme circumstances the NHS cannot provide. And I think we should be arguing for the reinstatement bill, which is a very good piece of legislation. There should be a moratorium on hospital closures. I think the Labour Party should be campaigning for the West London hospitals now to stop them being closed. And there should be an immediate call for expansion of nurse training and training of more GPs. So that's basically my message. Thank you very much for hearing me.
Simon indicated from us.
Thanks, John. I'm Simon Weller. I'm the National Organiser of ASLEF Train Drivers Union. Now, I think there is an element in this room of preaching to the choir. As much as I like it, I like a good hymn. But the question we need to be asking ourselves is, where do we go next? What do we do? We can all wallow in the misery that, you know, we can be the, oh, aren't things terrible, on the Labour Party awful, on Tusk awful, we can do the usual. I thought we did rather well in the best part of an hour before we ended up in that particular discussion. But I think the central problem is we've lost the argument on the orthodoxy, which is privatisation is the way forward. It's been going for 30 odd years, 40. And we haven't got an alternative, and I hate to use the phrase, we haven't an alternative narrative. And perhaps, this is me being parochial, the railways is part of that alternative narrative. Because people understand the railways, it's not an abstract concept. Most people use the railways most days. And the three big lies we were sold at privatisation was it would be cheaper, it would be there would be an increase in innovation, and there would be greater competition, which is what we're sold privatisation on. Perhaps we, and by we I mean the Labour Party, should be actually making the argument against these three things and making the comparator of the railway and say there hasn't been increased competition because the way the railways are structured, there is just generally one operator up that one line. In fact, the East Coast, which was very successful as a state-run enterprise, has now come into the competition authorities have got involved, saying, well, actually there's no competition because Stagecoach now own all the operators along that particular line. When they say there would be reductions in fares, well, I think we can quickly and easily put a lie to that. And more innovation from private entrepreneurs. The only big innovative, other than the subsidy farming that we've seen from the private operators, but the big innovation we've seen on the railway has been the Oyster card. That's a massive departure from our normal ticketing systems. That innovation came from the state-run Transport for London, actively resisted by all the private train operators. So, those are the three big arguments for privatisation, the orthodoxy. We need to have the Labour Party to have a little bit of backbone and say, do you know, privatisation isn't cut out to as great as we're all cut out to be. And start doing it in language, not abstract concepts, but doing it in language that people understand and say, do you know, the railway, that hasn't worked. And there's countless other areas where it hasn't worked. And rather than running scared from the fourth estate, perhaps the Labour Party should have this alternative message. We will take on those people who have natural monopolies and seek to rip other people off by simply taking them back. And actually a real simple message. And we shouldn't be afraid of the N-word. We should nationalise. Yeah. Because it isn't just our railway, it is actually our social infrastructure as well. The energy companies, railways, the water companies. Actually, they're the basic building blocks of a decent society. So this is what we should be saying. And the question I'm going to put is, how do we move from all having a nice moan about how terrible things are, to actually achieving something and achieving some change within the Labour Party? And I don't think the MPF is the way forward, judging by the mealy-mouthed words that has come out about the railway, about we will allow the public sector to bid. Yeah. Utter rubbish. It's just not where we want to be.
Jackie Davis, who's a consultant radiologist, co-chair the NHS Consultants Association.
Thanks very much for inviting me here today. I've been working in the NHS for far too long now, and I was one of the co-founders of the Keep Our NHS Public campaign, which I hope you all know about. And the tragedy about that campaign, and one of the real problems that I think we've got here today, is that we started that under a Labour government, because you've got people like Milburn who were busy stitching up the NHS with the private sector under the last government. And One of the things I absolutely agree with Tony, whoever else said it, it's about time somebody just admitted that Labour got it wrong to a large degree. And Labour got it wrong to the extent that when Lansley stood up with his shocking reforms, he was able to say, this is evolution, not revolution, and people could believe him about that. So there's the first big problem. Labour have got to disown the market in the NHS. Some of you are going to have a commercial break now. Last year, in desperation, we wrote NHS SOS, how the NHS was betrayed, which is the story of how the Health and Social Care Act got through the House. We have just written, and it's out next week, NHS for Sale, and that debunks the myths around the NHS. And one of the big myths around the NHS is it's inefficient and costly and we can't afford it. Bollocks, I'm sorry, it just is not true. And it's about time that Labour signed up to that. And when people say, where are you going to get the money from? We will get the money from stopping the market in the NHS in England, because of course they don't have it in Scotland and Wales. That would save somewhere in the region of £10 billion a year. That's an awful lot of nurses, hip operations, and all the rest of it. The private sector they're not, the press keep talking about creeping privatisation. Forget it, guys. This is across the front lawn, kicking your door down, privatisation. And the fact that they say, oh, it's a small percentage, don't be taken in by that, because the private sector is by no means interested in running the whole of the NHS, because the NHS is already the most cost-effective health service in the world. They want to cherry-pick off the bits that they think they can make a profit out of, although they can't always, because look at Vinci Brook, they couldn't make a profit out of that. And the effects of picking off the bits are so destabilising to the NHS that we have simply got to stop this happening. What is happening at the moment is we're wasting huge amounts of money on all this compulsory tendering that the Tories said they wouldn't bring in and is now happening. So your doctors and nurses, instead of looking after you, are in back rooms writing out proposals to run their own services, which they then lose to the private sector. Because guess what? People like Serco, G4S, who are the people who are winning these contracts, they have got deep pockets for loss leaders. They have got experience in writing these tenders. They have got squadrons of lawyers who are advising them. And their expertise is in winning public contracts. And then they are left to run a service about which they know absolutely nothing. And that's the scandal of what's been happening. It's all in our book. Please read it, because people have got to get out there and get the message out. So what are we asking for? That's the other book. I've given you all a flyer. This debunks the myths around the NHS. In particular, we can't afford it. It's not a good service. It's letting patients down. We're not privatising it. Rubbish. Private sector better than public. I agree with my colleague over here. They're absolutely hopeless at it. GPs have got the power. No, they haven't. Patients have got the choice and voice. No, they haven't. Communities will be able to say what they want. No, they won't. No, they won't. As we know from Lewisham, where Jeremy Hunt went to court to fight them over what they wanted. So we need to debunk these myths, and I think that book will be a powerful weapon in that fight. What do we need to ask Labour to do? Because I agree with my other colleague here. It's no good just standing here saying what we don't like, what's happening. They have to repeal the Health and Social Care Act, and absolutely totally consider it. They have to end the destructive market in the NHS, costing us £10 billion a year. They have to deal with the PFI mess. There is no way that hospitals can go on paying 7 and 8 times the value of the infrastructure that they're getting. It is crippling them, and those payments are ring-fenced, so that comes straight out of patient care. £11 billion worth of infrastructure in this country, for which we, the taxpayers, are paying £80 billion for the NHS. It's an absolute Wonga-scale scandal, and it has to be dealt with. No more financially driven cuts and closures, which we're seeing all over the place at the moment, called reconfiguration, in case the weasel language that we're all getting used to. Fair pay and terms and conditions for NHS staff. And I would say, get informed about what's happening to the NHS, because a lot of people, I'm not talking about the people in this room, I'm talking about all the people you can go out and talk to. They still don't get it, because the Tories have been very clever about how this fund is to us. So, read whatever you can, there's loads of stuff out there about it. And then deal with your own leaders, because most of them don't get it either, I'm afraid. And I would take the whole lot, apart from Andy Burnham, who I think does get it, and I would lock them in a room with Bevan's biography. Remind me of that. Sorry? In Place of Fear. Fantastic book, thank you. That just didn't know balls, but I have read it. Lock them in a room with In Place of Fear, lock them in a room with Bevan's speeches, lock them in a room with Ken Loach's Spirit of 45, and don't let them bloody out until they get it about the NHS, until they stand up and channel Bevan to people, because people want to hear that stuff. They want a publicly funded, publicly delivered, publicly owned NHS, and they will vote for Labour if you promise it to them. But I'm not hearing that at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Earlier on, people raised the issue of why haven't we discussed TTIP. Jeremy mentioned it. John Hillary's been working on War on Want on TTIP, so we're going to bring him in for a few minutes.
Thank you very much, John. John Hillary, I'm the Director of War on Want, Unite member, and on the organising committee of the People's Assembly Against Austerity. And yeah, everybody in this room, we all want to renationalise the railways, we all want to bring back into public ownership, not just the NHS, but all of the public services we've lost. We want to definancialise education. We know that. That's where we're starting from. None of that is possible if we allow TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, to go through. Let's be absolutely clear, and I've seen the offer that the European Union has made with our government. Health is in. Midwifery, physiotherapy, dentistry, hospital services. Rail is in. Bus services are in. The postal service is in. Water, wastewater, education at every single level. These are all in these transatlantic trade negotiations, and they're all being given away. And the Labour Party is supporting it tooth and nail. The Labour Party is the chief cheerleader for TTIP in this country. I've just come back from Brussels, where we've had another week of the negotiations there. And the Labour MEPs in Brussels are saying, we don't like the fact that everybody's always looking at us and criticising us for this. Well, it's because the Labour MPs in this country are the cheerleaders for TTIP. Labour is supporting a policy which is going to lead, on official estimates, not ours, on official estimates, to the loss of 1 million jobs. 680,000 jobs in the EU are set to go as a result of TTIP. Massive environmental damage and non-reversible privatisations. You can't get it back when it goes into those deals. And it's only really being left platform MPs in this country who've been prepared to stand up and say no to TTIP. Now, what are we doing about it is the right question. Well, we've got a massive movement across the whole of Europe saying no to TTIP. We've got a lot of political parties from the left, from Sinn Féin, if you've got a vote there, from Plaid Cymru, if you've come over from Wales, who are saying, we don't want this. We've got councils up and down the country saying no to TTIP. But we've still got a leadership of the Labour Party which says, we like this. And yes, Andy Burnham has made the point that once you've got health in TTIP, you'll never be able to get it back again. But all they're now doing is doing spin operations with the European Commission. You may have seen it. John Healey has sent it out again. Spin operations telling us there's nothing to worry about. Well, there's a hell of a lot to worry about. And what we're saying is, join this campaign outside and inside the Labour Party to say no to TTIP. 21st of this month, all of the European social democratic parties are meeting in Spain. And Douglas Alexander is going to represent the Labour Party. And they're having a meeting specifically to work out their position on TTIP. The UK Labour Party is going to be arguing pro-TTIP. Pro-TTIP. And this is a catastrophe for any of the privatisations we want to reverse. We've got a massive national and international movement with all the trade unions on side. I'm really glad that for the first time at the September Congress last year, all the trade unions had a completely solid motion of outright opposition to TTIP. And still, the Labour Party refuses to listen. So we're really grateful to those MPs in this country who've already said no. We're going to put together a register of all social democratic MPs across Europe who are saying no to TTIP to help those in other countries who are finding it a bit difficult to come out against it, to feel that they're not alone in doing it. We're gearing up with all of the other parties which are saying no to TTIP to be part of it. We ask all of you to be part of it. In your trade unions, in the local councils where you've got representation, and within the Labour Party. Make it clear, if you want to take back your public services into public ownership and public delivery, you have to say no to TTIP, otherwise you lose them for good. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Darren Williams from Welsh Labour Grassroots, which is the organisation of the Labour Left and Centre Left in Wales. Michael Sullivan and Jackie Davis talked very clearly about the implications of the disaster that has been privatisation and marketisation of healthcare in this country over the last 30 years, including, as they acknowledged, by the last Labour government. I just wanted to say, and I'm glad that Jackie Davis actually acknowledged this point, this is a problem primarily in England. In Wales and Scotland, we don't have the internal market in the NHS, we don't have this promotion of privatisation. We got rid of the internal market in Wales in 2008-2009, so we don't have the problem of foundation trusts becoming bankrupt and so on. We don't have trusts at all. We have a single integrated healthcare system in Wales which is planned and organised from the top down. And we abandoned the PFI early on. We've been able to build new community hospitals in Wales through conventional funding. We don't have private sector companies trying to exploit the NHS and make profits through independent sector treatment centres and things like that. We've got free prescriptions since 2007. Of course, this is exactly why the Daily Mail and the Tory front bench continually attack the Welsh healthcare system and suggest that Wales is a bit like North Korea or something. And be clear about this, the reason for this is because Labour is still consistently ahead of the Tories in the polls in the NHS every time there's a pity poll taken. And what they want is to try and discourage Labour from using the NHS as the political asset that it should be in the election campaign. And by suggesting that if Ed Miliband became Prime Minister, then this kind of North Korea sort of Stalinist dystopia that we have in Wales apparently would be spread to England. So I just want to make the point that we already have an NHS in Wales that has gone back to Night Veterans Vision, Jackie Davis talked about, and that is something we need to protect. And of course the problem is that we can still be affected by decisions that are made in London, because Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland are funded by the UK Parliament. So if they cut public spending, then that has a knock-on effect on the money that we've got available to spend on public services in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. And that's just one of the ways that we can still have a negative impact on our services that we try hard to protect. And again, to a TTIP, of course, if we have the government commits us to marketisation of services, the fact we've gone in a different direction in Wales and Scotland, won't save us from those problems that John Dory's been talking about. And the same, by the way, in education. In Wales, we don't have academies, we don't have free schools, we still have comprehensive schools right across the board. So what I'm trying to say is we have a workable system in public services that most of us would recognise is in keeping with traditional Labour values, and our leadership at a British level needs to recognise that system works and is popular, and that's the one we should adopt as a Labour Party policy across the board.
Some people indicated this morning.
Cheers, thank you. Dean Kirk, councillor for Hull City Council, former Labour councillor, who was kicked out for voting against the austerity budget. Different to Kingsley though, I will be supporting the candidate who's the Labour Party candidate for the election. I want to see a Labour government in 2015. Except I want to see a Labour government in 2015, a real Labour government. What I want to say about regarding privatisation is, on the 26th of February, our local council had to put its budget through, which under normal circumstances I would have to vote for a Labour budget, but I won't have to this year, not being part of that. And now my colleague Jill Kennett will also vote against the austerity budget in the local authority. But the thing is, this year, Labour councillors will be voting to privatise some of our services in the local authority. Swimming pools, leisure centres, libraries, and also next month we've got a meeting to actually decide if our adult social care is privatised. Now we've seen what's happened in Doncaster, and really big strike in Doncaster for the Care UK workers, and what money they've lost, and that will start happening all across the country if we don't see a Labour government in 2015. But the thing is, what do we say to Labour councillors now as Michael was talking earlier on about the finances and that the money's there, we sit on £8 million worth of reserves, pockets of reserves regarding VAT money. That money's all sat there. If you're at home and you can't afford your rent, you take it out of the bank and you use your savings. I say to local authorities, start using your savings, start using your reserves. They're not for rainy days, because we all know it's pissing down out there. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Jill Mountford and I'm part of the Save Rich Muslim campaign, and I've been asked to do a brief introduction on campaigning around privatisation. Before I do that, I want to say a couple of things on a few of the things that have come up on my mind. First is to thank John for organising this, because I think it's a much... Am I speaking too fast? Sorry, I do apologise, it's a habit I have. Thank John for organising this, because it's a much needed event. I'm going to make a criticism, because I'm like that. I think it's a bit late in a sense, and I'm not blaming John for that, because he's had the nous to organise it, but the left needed to be organised a lot sooner and a lot tougher, and to use what Jeremy said about being quite robust with people when we're talking about the arms trade, the left needs to be far more robust on every question. The guy from Maslow said, the trouble is we haven't got a narrative. We've got a huge narrative, we've got loads to say, we've got a massive agenda, and things have been said here today. My concern is that what is the plan now to pull all this together, and how are we going to use it effectively in the next 90 days? Yeah? I desperately, like millions and millions of people in this country, desperately want the Tories out. The very thought of having a Tory UK Lib Dem pact coalition is just horrendous, right? And I don't want a Labour government to take a price. I want a Labour government that's going to deliver on the things that we need, that our class need, that we want and desperately need. So we've got a common ground there, but I do want to know how. Is there going to be a sequel to this event? How are we going to come together now with a programme that we can implement? I want to say a couple of other things. We've lost things over the last 30 years, not just services and big aspects of the welfare state and public sector. We've lost a battle of ideas. Their ideas about privatisation, their language that they use, is actually much more out there in the public arena than our languages. I've heard things today. The guy at the end there is Ian Malcolm Walker. He raised something that when I first got involved in class politics, I cut my teeth on it. It was there. Everyone was talking about it. Loads of people were talking about it. The very idea that why, when there's mass unemployment, when there isn't enough jobs for people, why are we all working longer hours for less pay? What is going on? People know what to talk about that. I remember the first time I heard mentioned the idea of a maximum wage. It was like a massive light went on my head. But why has no one talked to me about this before? We were talking about minimum wage. We've got these ideas. We've had some of these ideas for 150 years or more. Yeah? We've had these ideas for a long, long time, but we're forgetting to use them. We've lost our confidence about being robust and audacious enough to raise them. They have set the agenda, and we're chugging along with it. Even in this room, we've started to chug along with that agenda. And we've got to regain our confidence on that. So part of this is about fighting privatisation. I think it's important. I want to raise this element of the campaigns that exist around the country. There are many, many campaigns around the country fighting to defend the NHS. Some absolutely stunningly brilliant campaigns. There are so many health experts in this country now, ordinary working people who have had to turn their time and energies to defend their local health service and have become so clued up and so knowledgeable about the NHS. We have to, all of that energy and power needs to be honest, and I don't think it is being at the moment. The other thing that is lacking in that fight is the unions. There's an element in the room today, I feel. Unless we can get the trade union movement to start fighting for the needs and desires and wants of the rank and file of those unions, we're going nowhere. Community campaigns can beat and win in certain fights, and Lewisham shows that. But we cannot say the NHS on its own. It's going to depend massively on the might of the union movement being moved. And I can see nothing, absolutely nothing, in Labour at the moment that says that they're going to help, aid, encourage and allow that to flower and happen. And that's scary. So, I just want to add a couple of things to the demands that Jackie raised, and one of the things that hasn't been mentioned particularly is reversing privatisation. We've got, you know, an end to privatisation, that's a demand, stop privatisation, no more privatisation of the health service. I want, and I think we should want, I'm sure many of you do already want this, we want all that privatisation has happened so far, reversing. It's unacceptable. Get it out of the NHS. We also, when I first got involved in the Save Hospital campaign, many of the Labour Party activists involved, very, very good. But there was a section that used to get the EBGBs big time as soon as PFI was mentioned. Nervous, nervous, nervous. Can't account for it, don't want to face up to it, don't like it, don't mention it. Right? We have to mention it. It's a big, bad thing that will not go away unless Labour decide to do something about it. It isn't enough, apologies are cheap as we all know, it isn't enough to apologise for it, or to say we made a mistake. That's very cheap, anybody can do that. I want to know what the Labour government will do, and what we can do to make them deliver on this, what they will do to get rid of PFI, to liberate hospitals and the public sector generally, schools, prisons, and all the rest of it, from the big PFI debts. Yeah? So I think that has to be, we should have to consider, that has to be one of our demands. Yeah? So an end to privatisation, reversal of the cuts, reversal of privatisation, and an end to PFI, liberate hospitals from PFI. That has to happen, else we're going nowhere.
Thanks, Mark. I want to try and see if we can cover everything, but it's important that we hear a Scottish voice here as well. I was pleased to welcome Neil Findlay.
Thanks very much, John, and greetings from the campaign for socialism in Scotland. And actually, it's bloody warmer in Scotland than it is here today, I'll tell you. Post-referendum Scotland is quite a strange place to be in at the moment. We have a situation where the winners are acting like losers and the losers are acting like winners. And we did win the referendum. The Labour left took a position to oppose independence. That was the right thing to do. And we won that referendum by 10%. We should never forget that. But during that period, the nationalists do as all nationalists do, and they appeared as all things to all people. They promised to be socialists in Glasgow and Tories in rural Perthshire, and that's what they will do again at the forthcoming election. They talk a very good left game, but when you get down to the nitty-gritty, they act right at every turn. Their main policy, economic policy during the referendum, the main redistributive policy was to redistribute a 3% corporation tax cut to the highest, to the wealthiest people. They had a prospectus that would have seen Scotland become a petrol economy based on the oil price, and they saw an oil price of $113 a barrel to finance public services. This week, the oil price is under $50 a barrel. We would have had turbocharged austerity if Scotland was independent at the moment, and that people on the left shouldn't forget that, because some have been seduced by the idea that independence would make Scotland some kind of progressive beacon. I think we were right to reject that. We were right to say that we want UK-wide solidarity, and we were right to say that we want the UK trade union movement remaining as one trade union movement. I don't think we fight the corporations by giving them 3% tax cuts and dividing the greatest challenge to them that is the trade union movement. Mick Cash spoke about the privatisation of the railways and the opportunity to bring the railways back into public ownership. Well, we had the opportunity in Scotland recently to at least bring it back into a not-for-profit situation and get a public sector bid. And there was a public sector bid that was successful. Unfortunately, it was a Dutch public sector bid that was successful, and that was the nationalists who allowed that to happen. I also heard my comrade from Wales there speaking about the NHS in Wales and the successes of it. Every week, the nationalists in Scotland attack the Welsh NHS, saying that Labour can't run it properly every single week because the NHS in Scotland is under as much pressure as it is here. They also are the architects of the council tax freeze that everyone's seen the consequences of. It happened in Scotland for 7 years we've had a council tax freeze. Our councils are in crisis and it's only getting worse. We spoke also about an alternative narrative. I stood for the leadership of the Scottish Labour Party, and we, and I say we, it wasn't me, my campaign developed that alternative narrative. We put forward the case for building council houses and a national housing bank. We put forward alternatives to PFI, using historic low interest rates and the new powers that the Scottish Parliament will get to borrow to refinance the whole PFI thing. And can I tell you what the nationalists do with PFI? They change the name of it. They call it the non-profit distributing model. The only problem is it distributes profit. But as long as you change the name, everybody believes that it's something different. It's exactly the same. So we put forward a whole different narrative on Trident, on social care, ending the council tax freeze and all the rest of it. We didn't win. We didn't win, and that's the harsh reality of the situation. But I think those issues that we raised as that alternative narrative, we now have to get out there and campaign on and start to build a coherent alternative. If that's what this meeting's about, then we need to start from today and start building it. We have got some very clever people in this room who can start to pull that in to get together into some sort of manifesto going forward. Finally, can I say 2 things? Ashcroft had a poll out this week about the situation in Scotland and looked at 16 seats where the Yes campaign won and what that means for the forthcoming general election. Labour would win 1 of those seats if there was an election just now, according to that poll. The average swing away from us is 21%. 21%. Please watch what's going on up there. If you can assist us, then please come and do it because we really need your help. I'll try and cheer you up with one final thing. The poll also said that the ginger rodent Danny Alexander will lose his seat. So I'm afraid it's the only thing I can cheer you up with.
I want to thank Neil Percy for standing in Scotland. It was
Yeah.
a really good campaign. Well done. Before we finish this section, I want to bring in a teacher's voice. Is Philippa here? Yeah, Philip.
Thanks very much. I'm Philippa Hart from the National Union of Teachers. The fragmentation of the education system through academisation and free schools has hugely threatened the education system of the schools that we work in. And we are campaigning very hard that schools must not be run for profit. Between May 2010 and December 2013, the DfE paid over £76 million to 14 private companies for legal, accountancy, management consultancy and property services for the academies and free schools programme. Now, every penny of that really should have been going back into schools and for the education of the children we work in. So we have in our manifesto here, which is available today, some key recommendations that any future government must rule out the idea that schools should be run for profit and a halt for any further privatisation or outsourcing of education services in schools. Now, people have been talking about things that we can do. One of the things that I think we can do is, I'm now volunteering NUT members around the country, is that we can get NUT members to come and talk to constituency Labour Party meetings about our manifesto and what we think what we think education should look like, and we can get this manifesto endorsed by Labour Party members and prospective parliamentary candidates all around the country as much as possible. It's something that we think that's really important. Get your picture taken with it, put it on social media, endorse the 8 steps that we have to tackling workload as well, like Sadiq Khan has done on Twitter. And by doing that, you'll bring in the teacher vote that is quite a powerful vote, because we talk to lots of people, we're out and about talking to people all the time. So look to our manifesto, there are copies on the table out there, and thank you very much.
We're going to go into our final session. I'll try and bring in as many people as possible before we go. We'll cut back on the final bit. Our final session is ending poverty pay benefits and restoring trade union rights. The introducers that we've got are Mark Sawalka, John Hendy, QC, and Ellen Clifford from DPAC. Could we ask Mark to come forward? Is he here? People are standing, so they want to come up to see you. He has this thing he carries about with him to keep him alive. I don't know why. So it's just, you know, how are you?
I'm very good, yeah.
Shall we just say, in terms of the campaigns in this last recent years, the PCS for this government has been the NUN. They've done everything they can to possibly break them. And the reason they haven't been able to break them is absolutely determined rank and file, but an absolutely determined superb leadership in Mark Sawalka.
Well, that's the nicest thing anyone said about me and you, is right. Thanks very much, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank people for the warm welcome. I've been asked to just do a lead off on the issues of poverty pay benefits and trade union rights. And I know we've got some esteemed speakers, and hopefully there'll be a good discussion. But I just wanted to start by putting this session in this context. Everything I want to say about poverty pay and benefits, I think, is linked to the fact that unless we have strong, independent trade unions in Britain, unions that are prepared to do something, stand up for their members and take action, then we will not see a reversal of the decline in wages, living standards, or the attack on the welfare state. So it's really good that these things have been linked together, because to my mind, the solution to them is fairly clear. So I just wanted to start with just a few facts and figures, just to try and put some of this into context. 5 million people in Britain today earn less than the living wage. Since the crash, our living standards are down by over 10%. Collective bargaining agreements that used to cover 80% of the workforce are now down to 25%. Trade union membership is halved, and as a result of the deregulation of the labour market, we now see fixed-term contracts, zero-hour contracts, and insecurity at work. And so anyone who is at work or is in a trade union will know that the squeeze on living standards has been absolute. In my own union, where we've had pay restraint now for over 8 years, we have members who are 20% worse off in real terms than they were 6 years ago. And some of these people are earning barely above the national minimum wage. So there's been a huge assault on our living standards, and it has to be said that the unions have been not very good in confronting it. It also has to be said that the Labour politicians, with notable exceptions, have been pretty dire too. Because it's all well and good saying we need a rise in the cost of living, and actually we need to see through growth better wages. But what better place to say, therefore, we'll do something about it where we can, and come out against the public sector pay freeze and say that Labour would increase people's pay in the public sector, not only because they deserve it, but also because that is a way that you can kickstart the economy and see it follow suit in the private sector. So when Ed Ball says he will keep George Osborne's policy on pay, we have to say that that is actually contradictory to his stated belief in growing the economy, and it's actually unfair. And by the way, it isn't attracting many voters either. And therefore, I think that, for us, has to be the challenge to our Labour politicians. But from where I stand, the challenge really has to be to the trade union movement. Because, you know, it is a fact that all this austerity we've been fighting, the privatisation you've been talking about, the assault on pay, the assault on jobs, if you actually consider the amount of joint action that we have seen across the unions since the coalition government's been in place, it really is feeble. It is a tragedy that we have had 1 or 2 days of mass industrial action where actually we can all see, had we done more of it and been determined to stick together, rather than in some cases take the crumbs off the table, we would have done much, much better. And ironically, the seems to me if we've done that, Labour might actually be in a better position as a political party too. But let's look also at the situation regarding benefits, because one of the things that does concern certainly my trade union, where we have members who work in the DWP, is that often the welfare state and the benefit system is the neglected part of the debate that goes on in politics. And you have to say, and I think we shouldn't mince our words about it, Labour's position on the changes to the welfare state and the attack on benefits and claimants has been appalling. In fact, much of what has been done is a follow-on from the policies rooted in James Pennell when he was the Secretary of State for Social Security. And therefore we've got to say to ourselves that what Labour must do is to reject the politics of stigmatisation, attacking those who are unfortunate enough to be unemployed, and recognise that we shouldn't tinker with the system. We need to see a radical change in our benefit system so that we don't have people living in abject poverty. So I think it's important that we consider the statistics. Along with declining pay, as I've said, we've seen a decline in the rate of benefits. Job seekers allowance is now £10 a day. It's £8 a day if you're under 25. We have one of the least generous benefit systems in Europe. You know, in the UK, our benefit system is based on benefits that are 13% of average earnings. Do you know, in Sweden it's 46%, in Germany it's 59%, and in France it is 66% of average earnings. And yet here we are on 13%, and people talk about benefit lifestyle, sort of benefit tourism, as if there's some halcyon days where people are coining the money. But you know, not only has benefits decreased massively in terms of value, the whole system has been corrupted so that the people whose job it is, PCS members who should be here to help people into work and look after them, are increasingly finding that they have to apply punitive benefit sanctions that have nothing to do whatsoever with helping people back into work. Listen to the statistics. In 2009, what we found was that sanctions, there was £11 million worth of sanctions. By 2012, there was £60 million worth of sanctions in the first 6 months of the year. Level of sanctions is up 137%, and the amount of money we've sanctioned is actually up 1,000%. If you work in a job centre today, you can get disciplined if you do not refer enough people for sanctions. 80% targets, by the way. And yet, if you are not referring people for sanctions, you get in trouble. You refer too many, you get patted on the back. All of our evidence to the Select Committee showed that the system has now become about trying to trip people up, get them to do things they cannot possibly do, which means that people are not only getting poverty rates of pay or benefits, but actually they get no benefits whatsoever. Because when you're sanctioned, even though that sanction reduces it if you appeal or get hardship payments, you don't get anything for the first couple of weeks. And therefore we literally have people who are on poverty levels of benefit finding that removed from them. It's absolutely disgraceful. Not just, it's disgraceful anyway in its own right, but in the 6th richest country in the world, you have to say, what are our priorities when we are seeing people driven to food banks and driven to all sorts of things just to make ends meet? And so there's the link. We've got poverty pay, we've got a dreadful benefit system, we've got a rise in work poverty and access to benefits because of crap low-level wages where we, the taxpayers, subsidise multinational corporations to pay unacceptable levels of benefits. So the whole thing needs to be challenged. But if we're honest, we don't see many politicians challenging it. It isn't helpful when Rachel Reeves, who has done some good things as the Shadow Secretary of State, starts by saying she will be tougher than the Tories. So when people are saying this sort of stuff, actually what you have to ask yourself is, why can we not get the opposition party to give some hope to those people who they will want to vote for them? And if they aren't going to do it, what our job has to be is to get the likes of John and Jeremy and the other left Labour MPs, the people active in politics, to keep articulating this case. But the best way they can articulate it, it seems to me, in Parliament, is if our trade unions and mass campaigns of all of us are making these demands all the time. So that they don't appear to be just fringe issues as certain lefties talk about. We make them absolutely central to the fairer type of UK we want to live in. Which must mean to say there shouldn't be any poverty, there should be higher rates of pay, a decent welfare state, until people can get back into work. So I'll finish on this point. To do all of that, we need stronger unions. Union membership is halved. nobody believes that the unions at the moment are exactly at their most powerful. However, with better leadership, more cooperation and more determination, we could be a hell of a lot more effective than we have been. And that means we're right to talk about changes to labour law, and I know John will probably talk about some of this stuff. We do need legal changes. We do need, for a fact, to say it should not be lawful. But where I've come from this morning, the National Gallery, where we've got a 5-day strike against privatisation, on the eve of that strike, one of our leading reps, who I think is going to talk to you later on, Candy Unwin, was suspended by the management on trumped-up charges and is now accused of gross misconduct. Disgraceful way to carry on. So where's the legal rights for our stewards? Where's the legal rights for our members to have meetings in the workplace at workplace time? Where's the legal rights for people to ballot in the workplace so that we can increase turnouts? Where's the legal rights to take strike action without our hands being tied behind our back? And where is the campaign that says if the Tories do win, and we have thresholds of 50% turnouts and 40% yes votes, they are attempting to ensure that we have hardly any strikes at a time we need more strikes now than ever before. So we've got to campaign for better laws and better legal frameworks. But I'm sure we can all agree with this, that no matter how good the laws, unless the unions get off their knees and unless we start fighting back with the type of determination of those who are attacking us, we will never do enough for working people. And you know, if that happened, not only would we see a renaissance in the trade union movement, it would mean those on the left, whether they're in or outside the Labour Party, would really see mass movements build underneath them that could mean all the policies we're discussing today had a chance of being realised. That's the type of debate I know you've been having and the one that my union would like to see. That yes, we have the right policies. Yes, we argue for people in the political arena to go and say this in Parliament and everywhere else. But ultimately, it's that we campaign for it all the year round and hopefully can bring it about. I hope you generally agree with that. I want to thank John for organising the meeting. I want to thank those who supported our strikers this week at the National Gallery and also the information officers in Winslow and Manchester. And I hope that we can go forward confident, raising these issues in the run-up to the election, but to be honest, whoever forms the government, that we carry on raising them to ensure that our battle continues all the time until we get justice for working people.
Next speaker is John Henry DC. John is, most of you will know, John is a trade union lawyer who's represented us time and time again and does a lot more work for the side as well as for the Institute of Employment Rights. John Henry.
Thank you, John. Thanks for inviting me. Professor Keith Ewing, Professor of Labour Law at King's College, London, and I do a lot of writing together. And we thought it might be useful to try and jot down 10 bits of the law at work that could be changed with a different government. Now understand, this is not a socialist programme, but these are points which are achievable. Can I read them to you? The right to a decent wage and to a decent income for those not in employment. By the way, no need to take a note. There's a 4-page pull-out supplement in the Morning Star one day this week. I won't tell you which day it is. Buy it every day. Number 2, the effective regulation of 0 hours contracts. Number 3, the right of every worker to be protected by a collective agreement. Number 4, the re-establishment of sectoral collective bargaining and wages councils. Number 5, the re-establishment of a Ministry of Labour. Number 6, the right to strike in accordance with international law. Number 7, the removal of a qualifying period for unfair dismissal. Number 8, the restoration of the redundancy consultation rights. Number 9, the right to legal protection for everyone who works, regardless of their legal status, whether employee, self-employed agency worker, or whatever. Number 10, the right of all workers to access to justice, including the abolition of tribunal fees. Now, I'm sure many people in this room can think of other things to add to that list, but it's not a bad start, not a bad shopping list that we could put to the Labour Party. Now, if I was asked what are the most important elements of that list, I would have no doubt whatever in saying it is the restoration of collective bargaining supported by the right to strike. Whereas Mark had the figures a moment ago, but he gave you a number of figures. They may not have just impacted upon you. Let me just stress again. In 1979, 82% of British workers was protected by a collective agreement or a collectively agreed term of their contract of employment. 82%, 8 out of every 10 workers. That was then the European average. In 2011, the latest figures, 23% of British workers. And you can be sure, because we know how the graph runs, that we're talking now at less than 23% of British workers. Probably only 2 out of every 10 workers in this country have any terms of their contracts regulated by a collective agreement. Now, in this audience, I don't need to spell out why collective bargaining and the protection of collective agreements is important. It's vital for democracy at work. There is no other way in which the voices of workers can be heard at work except through collective bargaining. It's vital for justice at the workplace because there is no other way in which the power of employers can be matched by individual workers. It's vital for the restoration of equality, or at least a movement towards equality and away from inequality. But perhaps most important of all, and the argument that really ought to persuade the Labour Party, is the fact that collective bargaining is the only way in which earning power can be lifted up, the only way that we can reverse the decline in the real value of wages that Mark mentioned before. There was a study published in January from the United States which showed, and it was a study of each state of the United States comparing the level of equality in pay and the level of collective bargaining. And lo and behold, those states that had the highest collective bargaining coverage had the highest rates of pay. The equation, the link between low pay and lack of collective bargaining is absolutely obvious. And that's the reason why, in the 1930s, the entire capitalist world turned to sectoral collective bargaining. That's to say, collective agreements which spanned a whole industry as the way out of the slump which started in the 1920s. That's the origin of Roosevelt's New Deal and the National Labour Relations Act of 1935 in America. That's the origin of the Accord Matignon in France in 1936. That's the origin of the Salzburg agreement in Sweden, which is the foundation for industrial relations there. And that's the reason why in this country we had joint industrial councils supported by wages councils that covered millions of British workers up to and through and beyond the Second World War. We need to return to that. But I began by saying that these demands are achievable. And I've often been told, indeed I was told by a former General Secretary of the TUC, that to demand the right to collective bargaining and the right to strike was hopelessly unreal and idealistic. But I want to read to you a judgment that was handed down by the Supreme Court of Canada last week. Last week. This is not some bygone era. And Canada, not the most liberal country on the face of the planet, and with a judiciary that is just as anti-union as our own. Let me read to you just a short passage. Bear with me. They said, most recently, drawing on the right of freedom of association, which is part of the Canadian Charter of Rights, in a case called Mounted Police, which was the week before last, the Supreme Court confirmed that protection for a meaningful process of collective bargaining requires that employees have the ability to pursue their goals and that at its core, the right to freedom of association aims to protect the individual from state-enforced isolation in the pursuit of his or her ends. The guarantee functions to protect individuals against more powerful entities. By banding together in the pursuit of common goals, individuals are able to prevent more powerful entities from thwarting their legitimate goals and desires. In this way, the guarantee of freedom of association empowers vulnerable groups and helps them work to right imbalances in society. It protects marginalised groups and makes possible a more equal society. The right to strike is essential to realising these values and objectives through a collective bargaining process because it permits workers to withdraw their labour in concert when collective bargaining reaches an impasse. Through a strike, workers come together to participate directly in the process of determining their wages, working conditions and the rules that will govern their working lives. The ability to strike thereby allows workers, through collective action, to refuse to work under imposed terms and conditions. This collective action at the moment of impasse is an affirmation of the dignity and autonomy of employees in their working lives. Striking, the powerhouse of collective bargaining, also promotes equality in the bargaining process. This court has long recognised the deep inequalities that structure the relationship between employers and employees, and the vulnerability of employees in this context. The role of association has always been vital as a means of protecting the essential needs and interests of working people. Throughout history, workers have associated to overcome their vulnerability as individuals to the strength of their employers. And this court affirmed in the mounted police case, that's the one the week before last, that the right of freedom of association functions to prevent individuals who alone may be powerless from being overwhelmed by more powerful entities while also enhancing their strength through the exercise of collective power. Nowhere are these dual functions of the right of freedom of association more pertinent than in labour relations. Individual employees typically lack the power to bargain and pursue workplace goals with their more powerful employers. Only by banding together in collective bargaining associations, thus strengthening their bargaining power with their employer, can they meaningfully pursue their workplace goals. Forgive me for reading so much of that, but if the Canadian Supreme Court can accept that, why can't the Labour Party?